Well, hello, friends. It's Friday. I know that sounds great to many of you. The work week is almost done. You're ready to transition into the weekend, a time of rest and relaxation. You faced a lot of difficulties this week, perhaps some things you weren't expecting, some difficult circumstances, decisions, whatever it may be. Speaking of facing difficulty, today we're looking at Esther chapters 1 through 4. And once we get to chapter 3, we are introduced to a man named Haman. He gains the trust of the king, and through that, he sees an opportunity to take care of a group because another man named Mordecai, who is a Jew, refuses to show homage and pay honor to Haman by bowing to him. And so Haman's going to take matters to an extreme measure, and he's going to try to wipe out the whole Jewish population. So as we get to chapter 4, we see Mordecai and all the Jews, for that matter, beginning to respond with what they know: sackcloth and ashes, fasting. They're crying. They're basically appealing to God for intercession in this situation. Well, whenever Esther gets wind of that, Esther's Mordecai's niece, when she gets wind, because she's now the queen, she appeals to him and sends clothes to him and said, hey, you don't need to be doing this. The king doesn't like this sort of a demonstration because it reflects negatively on him. Here's some clothes, please put them on. And he refused them. He said, I'm not putting those clothes on. What I'm doing here doesn't really involve the king per se. I'm appealing to a higher authority, and to God, that is. And so eventually, Mordecai sends the message of what the king is doing. Somehow Esther was not aware, perhaps. She certainly seems to respond that way. So that by the time we get down to verses 10, 11, and following, we see this. So Esther spoke to Hathach, that's the eunuch who was passing the word between her and Mordecai, and commanded him to tell Mordecai, all the royal officials and the people of the royal province know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who has not been summoned, the death penalty, unless the king extends the golden scepter, allowing that person to live. I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. So what's this about? Well, basically, Mordecai, through the communication coming by Hathach, said, hey, give this letter to Esther. And it was an appeal for her to go before the king, make sure he knew exactly what Haman was doing. Because if you go back and read in chapter 3, he took his signet ring off, gave it to Haman and said, hey, do what you want, and you can use my signet ring as a seal that I give approval to it. And so now Mordecai says, hey, I'm not sure the king understands the extreme measure to which Haman has taken here. You need to go before the king, you need to make sure he knows what's going on, and you need to make an appeal for us, your very own people. Now remember, as far as the king knew, he didn't know Esther's heritage. He didn't know that she was a Jew. That had not yet been revealed. And so Esther just says, hey, you know the law, and that law applies to every man and woman, that if somebody comes before the king and they're not summoned, unless he extends the golden scepter, that person is in risk of losing their life. So Mordecai responds in verse 13. Mordecai told the messenger to reply, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place. But you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Wow. Her uncle laid it down. And I'm talking about, this is great theology. This is also practical thinking. He says, hey, just because you're in that palace doesn't mean that you are going to escape the fate that has come to us all. And on top of that, who knows? You've been positioned there. You didn't get there on your own. It wasn't just by chance that you arrived. You didn't win a beauty contest, although by the king's standards, maybe she did, but by God's sovereign will, she is there. He says that in verse 14. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such time as this. Haman said, hey, by God's sovereignty, you are where you are to do what you can do in this moment. And you need to understand that if you defy God's will, then he says the fate that would come to you and your father's family, you'd be wiped out. So he's basically saying, hey, you think you're going to avoid any kind of problem, any kind of persecution by just ignoring all this, acting like it's not happening, when the fact of the matter is, God has positioned you to accomplish his purpose and will for his people, and if you refuse to do that, then he'll position somebody else to do that. He'll raise up somebody else to do that. What great confidence Mordecai had. He says, God will bring about deliverance. He had faith in that. And so he challenged Esther. He said, hey, think for a moment. Why are you where you're at? What's your purpose for being there? It's not just because you're pretty. although she was a very beautiful person, very beautiful and appealing to the eyes. It's because God put you there. And so Esther, having been challenged by those words, sent a reply. Assemble all the Jews who can be found. Fast, don't eat or drink for 3 days and nights. I'll have my female servants do the same thing, and I will do the same thing. After this, I'll go to the king, even if it is against the law, even if I do perish. Wow. He struck a chord, didn't he? He really resonated with the very essence of who Esther is and saying, hey, God has positioned you. Are you going to defy God's will in this? And now Esther says, let's appeal to God. Let's appeal to his mercy and grace in this situation to sustain my life. And even if he doesn't, I'm going to do this. I'm going before the king. Pray for me. Intercede for me. Wow, what a challenge. And what a reminder. Maybe we've never been in such a situation as this where the stakes were so high. But that doesn't mean that God hasn't positioned us to accomplish his purpose and will in the life of those that we work with, in the life of those we go to school with, in the life of those we enjoy recreation with, in the life of our family. Family sometimes is the hardest, isn't it? Because we've grown up with these people, we respect these people, some of them are older than us, and we just don't feel like we have the position to speak hard truths to them, and others have known us in less than desirable circumstances, and we feel like maybe we don't have the standing to speak to them, and yet God has positioned us. Our workplace. We oftentimes think, the work and faith have to be separated, but nothing can be further from the truth. Our faith is who we are. It's not just what we do. And it influences the things that we do. Now, I get it. You're saying, well, Brent, you're a pastor. You work in the context of the church. That's an easy environment. And I'll agree to a great extent. It absolutely is easy. But sometimes some of the hardest individuals to speak with and to confront regarding certain things are church members. It's tough like that. So let's not let those scenarios dictate and distract. Let's instead be determined. Determined with the belief that God has positioned us right where he wants us to accomplish his very will in the life of those around us and in our life for that matter. And if he's positioned us, he'll empower us. He will give us a strong sense of his purpose, and he will bring it about as we are faithful. We just have to be faithful. And here's the thing, Mordecai's right. If Esther had not interceded and it were God's will to deliver his people, which it seemed to be, since he was already beginning to usher them back into the promised land, then if Esther didn't step into that role, somebody else would. And it may well mean Esther would be removed just like the previous queen had been removed by God's divine providence and plan. But he challenged her, hey, who knows? Maybe it's that you are right where you are for such a time as this. And I want to encourage you to think the same way. It might well be that you are right where you are for such a time as this. And even though the circumstances that you're dealing with, the person that you're at odds with, or who's at odds with you, or maybe it's the rule, the regulation that's in place, you fill in the blank as far as what the scenario is. But the fact doesn't change that God has positioned you to make a difference. A kingdom purposed difference, a God honoring difference, and he will see that through. Well, friends, it's Friday. That means we need to begin planning right now to prioritize worship, to prioritize coming together corporately 8:30, 11 o'clock for a time of celebrating who Jesus is, what he's done, and what dynamic differences that makes in our life. We come together corporately through the overflow of what we've experienced individually by being in the Word and by spending time in prayer and by worshiping him maybe with the radio all week long. We come to overflow that. So make that commitment now. Lay aside everything that might challenge that and get in the way of that and stay focused and committed to being here in worship, celebrating Jesus this coming Sunday. And until we're together, friends, live sent.